Why is that in the way? Not sure why this guy is at the bottom. My name is Michael West. I work at a healthcare company. I'm a software developer over in Addison. And I work with PowerShell about as often as I can to connect different systems together, to automate tasks for people that I see are wasting huge amounts of time, which is always wonderful. And recently I've been working on a project with another guy in another country, and the project is integrating PowerShell into the Sitecore content management system. So you just take any content management system, if you've worked with it, imagine having PowerShell in there and being able to automate various tasks. So today I'd like to start off with, just talk to you, describe to you what is Sitecore, and then go into how the integration works, just some code that you would write to make it, connect with the CMS. And then imagine you are, using the content management system, how you could use PowerShell in the extensions to automate various tasks for yourself. With Sitecore, it's essentially a platform that you get out of the box. And if you have developed a website before, let's just say you've done an ASP.NET website, you essentially start from scratch, right? So you create a new project, you create the web config, the global ASCX, you do all that kind of stuff manually. Well, Sitecore comes with all that stuff out of the box, and it enables you to, I would say, rapidly develop a website in modular form. And you build a web form, you build user controls, and Sitecore has a convention to gluing it all together, and then essentially you end up with a website. So we start off with the login page. It comes with the ASP.NET security model built in. So you can, right out of the box, manage users, manage their access, and then eventually plug in the Active Directory module and do single sign-on with the application. I've logged into the desktop version. This is typically what a developer would see. So all of this is running in the browser, and they've built what looks like Windows XP into the browser. And I think it's for familiarity. Sitecore, I think they started around early 2000s. And so obviously XP would have been around. They would have modeled it after that. And so you get all these different options to manage Sitecore. So one of the first things that we would do if you were a content editor, someone that would go in and, let's say, create a new news article, you would bring up this new window that shows you the architecture of the website, and you get these items in a tree that lets you can drag these around and change the order of how they appear in the website. So yes, I want to move the order. So anything that would render pages, pages in Sitecore, they would follow this structure. And so as an architect for the CMS, you can tell it, I want this folder structure with these names, and so on. As you can see, I've got articles, and these articles are in a specific order. So if you were viewing the website, you would see them in the same order. With Sitecore, they represent pages as items. Items exist in the database. So you imagine you have a relational database with rows. Every row would have an associated GUID, and that GUID would represent something in the Sitecore system. In this particular case, we're looking at, let's see, I'll go up to a news article. News article would have a title, it'd have an abstract, a body, and other attributes that you would want to configure for that page as it is rendered on the website. And so in Sitecore, in their, in their custom database, you have a way to create new fields, and that would dynamically add it to the page. And you would build user controls that would map to these fields, and you control how it would render on the site. So there's a whole lot of stuff with Sitecore that I just haven't learned yet. It's every new release there's something that I discover I haven't known before in previous releases. But the major concept is in Sitecore you create items. Items are represented in this tree, and they are stored in a database. And then you create user controls and web forms, and you bind that to this data. You have placeholders. If you're familiar in an ASP.NET form, you would add like a content placeholder. Well, in Sitecore they have their own placeholder, and you can essentially stick these user controls into the page. So I'll give you a quick demo of that. If I were a page designer, so I want to determine how the website appears on specific pages, I can bring up this page editor screen. So this is what the page would look like if you were in production. Just has this menu at the top. And this menu allows you to control the look and feel of the website. So for example, if I wanted to change this picture, I can look at what they have called the media library and swap out the picture. So very quickly a user can change the look and feel of a website. I can, let's say I want to change, let's see, maybe I want to switch out, or I want to add something, some type of rendering to this page. It allows me to do that. So rapidly build a website. What it requires is the development team to build these controls for you. And once that's available, then you're able to go design, do whatever you want. I can, in place, I can change content. So let's say welcome 1. And then if I save it, then I can go to whatever that item would have been. As you can see here, welcome 1. So I can edit in place in the page editor. Pretty neat thing. This is probably an expensive product. I don't know what it costs, but
That's what I was thinking.
but you can get essentially a trial license, and as a developer, teach yourself how to do this. The way I see it, there are not that many developers in the US, so if you learn how to develop in Sitecore, very quickly you could find a job. It comes out of Europe, it's based out of Denmark. A lot of European developers, so there are probably a dime a dozen like ASP.NET developers, but in the US, there's just not that many people. And if you know it and you're looking for a job, we'll probably hire you because we're looking for more resources now. There's so much that you can do with this system as a platform. I would say it's similar to SharePoint in terms of developing as a platform, but it's geared more towards a public website, whereas SharePoint has the back end for collaboration, and there's just so many features available in SharePoint. This is focused on building a website as a platform and allowing content editors to swap content. So there are, so there's the content tree, which is what we just looked at. So you create articles. There's layouts, which is where you map Sitecore items, things that would appear in here, to physical files. So I can say that I want a layout, a main layout, which let's just say in this example is the desktop version of the site. Then this layout references this physical web form. And this mobile layout represents this mobile layout. So in their system, you tell it which files to connect to, and in a layered approach, it will render the web form, and it'll render the user controls, and the user controls will render the text, and you eventually end up with a page. So pretty neat stuff. As a developer, this has been huge because I don't have to start off with all the boilerplate code that a ASP.NET website has. Immediately, I can start off with the architecture of the website without even building, web form or user control, any coding. I can come into Sitecore and design how the website will appear in some fashion. In terms of, you have a home page, and that home page has menu items, and those menu items have child items, and you end up with footers and headers and all sorts of crazy stuff. And then you can come in and have a design team build the website in terms of presentation. And let's say next year they want a totally different website. In a traditional .NET, ASP.NET website, you would have to migrate all of that content. Well, in Sitecore, you just change the controls and you swap out the HTML, if you will, and it will render a whole new website. You change the CSS, you change the markup, but the content would still be rendered, assuming you map those fields the same way. So if you have $1 million or however much it costs to spend on this, go for it. Big companies would obviously be spending money on it, but if you were a developer, what I did was I contacted Sitecore and said, hey, I want a license key so I can practice development at home on a virtual machine. So they gave me a trial license key last, I think, a year, and I was actually able to install a full version. They just give you a limited number of users. The way I understand it is you license the software and you pay for, let's say, a 10-pack of users, so you can have 10 simultaneous editors logging in and doing stuff. So this has been pretty fun to work with. Okay, so what does this mean with PowerShell? Well, if I were a user, and let's say that I created a bunch of articles and I wanted to move those into a different directory, well, I can click in here and say, oh, I want to change the order. But if I have, let's say, 300 articles, that's a huge waste of time to go through here and drag and drop with a mouse. I mean, obviously it's faster than maybe if you were doing it in a traditional ASP.NET environment where you were having to copy files to a new folder, you do some kind of Xcopy or whatever you would do. But in here, you still have to go through the manual process of changing the order of articles, or let's say you have articles that have a specific word in there and your company is being sued for this word. Then you have to go to 200 pages and replace that word with something else. Like instead of saying pre-existing conditions, it has to say other health conflicts or something like that, whatever word you want to make up. Well, they'd have to go onto every page. Well, first they'd have to find every page that has that. Then they'd have to go into the page, make the change, save it, publish it. So scripting is a wonderful way to automate this process. Let's see. So how does the integration work? It's really what we're going to talk about now. You start off with a .NET library, and through some form and fashion, you bind that to Sitecore, and you tell Sitecore how to use it. So we start off with a .NET library. Actually, I haven't launched it yet, so let me go to it. You're essentially creating excuse me, a Visual Studio project, and this project will have all the necessary code for creating commandlets and communicating with Windows to run PowerShell commands. So as the project loads up, I'll be able to show you the integration specifically with the Windows environment, and then we'll later go on to how it integrates with Sitecore. So we have code for commandlets, and we have code for creating a host, a scripting host. This is similar to what Microsoft would have created in the console or in their ISE. They've created their libraries, and in their libraries it would communicate with the operating system. And then on top of that, they would build other libraries that would connect to PowerShell's providers, registries, so on and so forth. And so you can do that yourself in your own project. So in PowerShell, you can create script modules, and you can create commandlet modules. The commandlet modules are obviously compiled code, but it ends up with the same result. So let's say, for example, I wanted to create my own provider. Then I would create the necessary code referencing the system management automation library, which is something available in Windows PowerShell. So you reference that, and then you begin to write your own classes that implement the Windows PowerShell code. So in this case, we created a provider, and this provider inherits from some of the automation providers. And so then you just start coding commandlets that you want. And there are plenty of articles out on the internet that describe how to create a commandlet module. So I won't go too much into actually how you write one, but we could come back another time and go in depth on that. I imagine you've had someone here to do that before. So scripting in Sitecore, what is currently available? So there is something called Sitecore Rocks, which is a Visual Studio plugin or extension, and it allows you to manage much of Sitecore as you would in the browser, but you can do it from Visual Studio. So if I wanted to create a new article, well, you could do that in Visual Studio using this plugin. Well, you can also, there's a PowerShell integration with it that would allow you to do some of those commands, Windows PowerShell commands in Visual Studio. PowerShell extensions, which is what I'll be discussing today, which is a module it's essentially an extension to Sitecore, and it connects Sitecore with Windows PowerShell using its own internal provider. Sitecore PS Terminal, I've never worked with it, and I believe that unofficially the development is ceased. So won't go into that. Revolver, which is really where it all started. A gentleman named Alistair started this project. I believe it was a paid project. And I think it cost somewhere around $3,000 for this to do command line capabilities. I think it was like an external window, and it would still communicate with Sitecore. So in standard PowerShell, you have, let's say, the ISE or the console, and then there's a run space, which would contain all of any scripts that you run, any variables, all of that would exist in the run space. And it has a host that would host all of this running processes and whatnot. And it will have its native commands, excuse me, and it'll have the Windows providers, which would communicate with the registry, with the file system, and whatever you've created. So what we've done is created a script session. It's basically a class, an object that exists in the HTTP context in a session within ASP.NET. So this object sits inside a session, and we've created our own commandlets, own provider to communicate with Sitecore content. So if I run back real quick, if you imagine using getItem and the provider you're working with is the file system provider, you would connect with the C drive, the D drive, whatever. In Sitecore, with the Sitecore provider, you can connect to what they would have called the master database or the core database or the web database. These databases contain content that you use within the Sitecore environment, The web database is the published content. So if you imagine going to a website and you see the home page, that content would come from the web database. In the master database, that's where you traditionally work with what I showed you previously with the browser. You're going creating items. It has all the versions of all the items that you create. So if today you have version 1 and tomorrow you need version 2, which totally rewrites an article, then master database would contain that. The core database would contain the security model and other settings. So now to the demo of how you would use PowerShell, or the PowerShell extensions within Sitecore. So what we've created is, for starters, a console, and you can run PowerShell commands. Doesn't format very well in this resolution, but you can imagine getting objects. Let's say I want to do get child item, and let's say I want the name. Okay, so here I just have the name. If I wanted to change over to the file system provider and run the same thing, so seamlessly you can work both in the Windows environment with the Windows providers, or you can work within the Sitecore environment with the Sitecore provider. I can run basically all the same commands and get variable, so we could see that the app path is running. So this web application is running excuse me, from this directory, and there's same variables that you would see in the console, in the PowerShell console. As I shown just a second ago, you get the tab completion with both the commandlets and with the parameters. And so this is pretty straightforward. Let's see, Control Enter, I think. Actually, so if I want to, I was actually going to show some help, but it doesn't look like I know the command to do that. But we also have the ISE. And the ISE is intended to look like the ISE. You have, let's see, I think it's Shift Enter. I forgot what the command was. Shift Enter, maybe. Maybe that. Oh, yes. Sorry, I haven't used it in a while, so I'm like, oh, what am I doing? Okay, so you get in the ACE code editor, which is the text area that you see here. It's JavaScript plugin that was added into this system. It supports this little auto completion window, and so in the plugin that we created, we connect with PowerShell. We retrieve the list of commands available, or whatever would match up, and then we return it from the web service and essentially generate this little pop-up. The integration uses the tab expansion 2 function in PowerShell 3, and I think there was one in PowerShell 2, and it's there's a kind of a workaround, but in PowerShell 3 it works much better. So I tab to complete that, and then I can execute, and here you get the output that you expect. And I believe, let's see, was it show list view? It's a command that we created. Some of them, they may not follow the PowerShell conventions of naming, so please don't freak out with the word show. Probably expect the word out, something like that. But it is what it is. Okay, I don't know how to use the command, but I'll show you an example here in a little bit that will help you see an example. So I can write just about whatever I want in here. Let's see. See, Notepad is not running. Okay, but if I went and started a Notepad, ran it. So there's proof that it actually is communicating with the Windows environment.
Is it doing syntax highlighting, or is it? I can't.
Oh yeah, it is doing that. It's basically CSS based, so in like some regular expressions, and so based on whatever pattern that you have for commandlet, so verb dash down, it will look for that and do the syntax highlighting.
Is the editor doing that?
Yes,
Or are you doing it?
the editor is doing that. So the Ace Code editor supports HTML, JavaScript, all sorts of languages. And just to show you real quick, Ace. Do a quick Google search. On their website, they show the plugin built in right into a web page. It started off with, let's see, what is it called? I think it's called Cloud9. It is an in-browser editor using Node.js, all running out of probably Apache, whatever it's running from. And so in this editor, you get the same syntax highlighting and whatever features. So what they've done is in the process of building the editor, they've created a separate project for the editor itself outside of the IDE, and which eventually resulted into me being able to do this. Previously, this was a simple text area, and with the plugin, you map it, you do some JavaScript calls, it looks at a text area, hides it, and then renders this Ace Code editor. And so, as you see, you get the flashing cursor, you get control space, you get the tab completion, and then within Sitecore, you can customize these ribbon controls. And so when I created this button and I click it, it eventually calls a command that will execute custom code. It takes this script, runs it against Windows PowerShell, and voila. So I can show you examples of how we've created functions. So let's say I created a function. And this function would clear what Sitecore has as archive. You can create, you can delete items in Sitecore, and that would go to Sitecore's recycle bin. So if I go into Sitecore, and let's say I want to delete this guy right here. Yes, I want to delete it. Then you can go into their recycle bin, and here you go. You have an item in the recycle bin just as it was in the tree, and then I can restore it, and then it would show back up in the tree. Well, then I can write a PowerShell function that communicates with Sitecore and empties the recycle bin. So let's say that you have authors creating content on a regular basis, and they're deleting content all the time. Well, this content will fill up the database at some point, right? So you want to purge that data. Well, what you could do is in the ISC create a function with all the comments and everything. You can create the advanced functions because it's just calling against PowerShell using its own provider, and run your commands to empty the recycle bin. I imagine, has anyone not written an advanced function before? So basically an advanced function turns a, what do you say, a not advanced function in PowerShell, a script function, into what would operate like a commandlet. And so then you get all the benefits of.
Add some of that to some of my scripts.
Yeah. So it when you start off with you know, basic function like let's say get name, and I just put in Michael. So this function won't do too much for me, but I could add validation to, you know, ensure the input that comes in, just like you would in the commandlet. And so in the Visual Studio project that I showed previously, there are commandlets available, but if you wanted to extend it and not have to go the route of recompiling the code, then you could write a function in Sitecore and then create like a scheduled task that runs your function. And so just to test that this works, then it outputs that name. So in Sitecore, in the PowerShell extension, we've created a couple different things that the admins for Sitecore can work with. We've created a script library, and some of these will create menu options in different parts of Sitecore. So for example, the control panel, if you created something in here, then when you go to the Sitecore control panel, let's say administration, we have a clear old archive items, and then it shows up in a menu somewhere else. And then this connects to a function that would have been written here. And as you can see, one of the fields available in this Sitecore item has script code. So let's go check out that edit with the ISE. And now I can write whatever function code I want or script code. And then when someone clicks that button in Sitecore, it will run this function or run the script against the provider, whichever provider you're connected to. So in this instance, we are in the context of the home page, and we could change that to be in the context of, you know, some other article. Okay, so now against the job function, I could delete that, or I could change whatever attributes I want. Let's see, execute it. In Sitecore, you can create modal windows. You essentially extend their UI based on XML files that you can create. Or in this case, we have a read variable function. And when you run the read variable, there is code behind that in the Sitecore PowerShell extensions module that will render this pop-up. And it accepts input, and that input now becomes available as variables in the session. And so if I proceed, here you can see that I hit proceed, and then it ran this script, and this is just a path to where it is in the tree. It executed it, which means it's now in the session, just as if you copied a function in the ISE, pasted it in there, ran it, and then called the function. And then call the function with the parameters and then output the results. So we could, in this case, it's me initiating running this directly, but I could also create a scheduled task. So if I go to tasks, the task feature is available out of the box in Sitecore, but you can extend the task to do whatever you want. Like you could write your own task extension that would scan the hard drive for files or whatever. And in this case, we created a new scheduled task, which is using the PowerShell script command, which is in the library that we developed. And that will run on some specific schedule. And if I want to, let's see, Oh, I'm sorry. So this scheduled task references this item in the tree. This item in the tree, let's see, we go to script library, examples, script testing, task test. So we created another script in the library, and all it does is run whatever code we want, right? So this is, I guess in simple terms, we took something that is fairly easy to do, build your own PowerShell commandlets, and a system that, in my case, I'm familiar with, Sitecore, and found a way to bridge those two together using capabilities of Sitecore to extend it using configurations and things like that. And now I can run whatever code I want in an automated fashion. So let me just do another example of changing data. Hopefully I don't break it. Okay, so I'm in the context of the master database, which is really what we're looking at in the Sitecore environment. And if I do get child item, I get all these guys. And if I want to do recursively, which is probably a bad idea, it will return to me all the children of that one day.
Do you wait for the whole buffer to come back before you send it, or do you send it in chunks?
It's actually in chunks, and it must have overloaded on it. But generally the way it would work, like when you, in the integration with the help, it will communicate with the web service. So in the browser, when you run something, it connects to the web service in the application, just a SOAP service. And that SOAP service then talks to Windows PowerShell and collects whatever information, then brings it back, and then the code in the browser will then render whatever we want in here. And if you were, for example, checking for help, that would come as like partial responses. I'm not sure what the limit is, but let's say that it was going to return like 500 different help documents. It would bring back chunks of that, but all spit out within the same output. So like if I did get process, oh, it looks like I broke something. Let's see. Let's see if this works. This is a command that was written for the plugin that would recycle the application pool. So hopefully this corrects the issue and I can continue the demo.
Do you have to do all of the Sitecore functionality within the browser, or could you load it as a module inside the regular Odyssey?
We haven't gotten there yet. So one of the major requests is, how can I do this but on my build server? And so if you wanted to do it like that, you could write PowerShell code that connects directly to the web service. That would be the first option. So you can load the module in the ISE and actually see all the commands available, but it's not in the context of the environment, right?
So there's just nothing to establish the context.
Right. So when it's running within the context of the web application, then it knows how to connect to the database and so on. But if you were to write PowerShell code that communicated with the web service, then you could still do all of that within the context of the web application. So I haven't done much with that because my idea is that, I have a build server script that deploys it, and then once it deploys, then I can have an automated script within Sitecore that will publish content and do all that stuff. I don't really want to tightly couple my build process to the application actually running, except deploying the code. So if the web application isn't available, then no code is deployed. But other than that, I would like everything to be managed within Sitecore, because then I can log into Sitecore and make those changes versus having to log into the build server and make changes.
Or do a PS
Right. And kind of to that point, you can basically do all the commands that you'd want to do within the ISE or within the console, such as remoting. I've tried it a couple times, but I don't have another computer to connect to. But you just, my perspective is, well, I could be in the Windows environment running these commands, or I could be in the browser, which I have access to, right? So in production, the Wintel team may not give me access to log into the box, or they may not give me remoting access into the box, but they don't know, but I can log into here and I can do whatever I want. So if I wanted to rename a file,
Or give yourself access.
I've tried it. I've tried to add myself to the administrators group, and I think the service account running in the application pool doesn't have the ability to do that, or in this case, the user account I'm using didn't have access to do that, so I couldn't essentially add myself to a group and then go remote in. But that's what I tried to do that. Yeah, it is good. I'm comforted to know that you can't do that. But I spent a whole day trying to figure out if I could, if I could, do that. But let's say I changed to the file system provider, and I wanted to create a new file. Was it new item? Here I want to create a README. What is it, file? So now I have a README file. So for a Sitecore administrator, you could go back up content, you could back up log files, you could shuffle files around. So one example of what I've had to do is when I do a release, if a web config needed to be renamed, then I could go script out renaming that web config file. Let's say I wanted to disable that feature. One really cool thing with Sitecore is how they manage their web config files. Let's go to there real quick. So everything's within the website folder. Under AppConfig, there's an include directory. And Sitecore will intelligently, I say intelligently, but it will look through all these config files and patch them together. So if Sitecore has some default functionality, you can create a config file in here that overrides that functionality. Let's say in our example, we wanted to add our own module. So you create a config file for that module, and you tell Sitecore what to do with the DLL that you created. So this is how we, in the presentation, this is the configuration portion. This is where we, for Sitecore, we're able to connect the commandlet library that we've built into Sitecore, and it knows how to process it. So in Sitecore, you have pipelines. Pipelines can run at the start of the application, or some other process may initiate a pipeline. So if you're thinking like an application where you want to minify and bundle your JavaScript and CSS, well, you could create a pipeline that will bundle all of that together. And in this case, we create a pipeline that will connect Sitecore to the module that we created. So here it's just XML. Sitecore does the rest on based on the conventions that you provide. So in this case, I have a provider item, and I create a patch that looks for this text within one of the other XML files, and then replaces it with my text, or actually inserts it before. So this is a Sitecore feature, but this is how we're getting them to talk to each other.
Is that similar to like wiring up an event, or is it really just putting yourself in that batch, in that pipeline?
It's putting myself in the pipeline. So out of the box, Sitecore will have its own processors that run. Let's say a processor is to resize images. Like if you have a responsive website, and in Sitecore you have a image placeholder, and you give it width and height, but then you built a responsive website where you want to shrink it down. Well, the pipeline can generate the code necessary to detect that when you shrink the browser, that it will re-render that image, and or like it would request a new image and replace it with a new URL. So,
insert
right. It basically is inserting. We're injecting our own process into the Sitecore pipeline, and there's other things that you can do, like you can create events, and when you hit save, you want to secure a specific naming convention, and that naming convention is lowercase with no hyphens, and then ultimately your website is rendered using SEO recommendations. So then you have hyphens in the URL. So you remove the hyphens, and then when you render the URL, it adds them back. Well, we could in here we could inject our own script code that would run a function that I've created or run a commandlet that I've created to also enforce those naming conventions. Or you could have it publish items when you hit save or something like that. So Sitecore in itself is very flexible. Then we're able to go in and do whatever we want as developers. So we have this configuration file, which I just showed. And as I showed, I can create a new item. I can remove the item. And then it's gone. Therefore, in the Sitecore context, I could remove items or move items into different directories. I could scan items. Let's say I want to go to the content, and I want to go to the home and job function. And then I can rename to, let's see if that works. So if I go into the, sorry. If I go into the content tree, marketers has now marketers 1. So I've just automated or potentially automated a way to manipulate content. I actually had a request the other day where they wanted to use include files in the website. And if you ever use server-side includes, it's an HTML file with some markup, and then based on some convention, you'd stick that in your markup, and it will read in that file and inject that content into the page. Well, I didn't want to do that. I think that's a dated way to do like token replacement, if you will. So I created, in Sitecore, I created this short codes. If you've used like WordPress, you can create short codes where you say like bracket YouTube and then some URL, and then WordPress will replace that with the video placeholder for a YouTube video. Well, I wanted to reproduce that into Sitecore. So what I could do is create my own code that will inject that using the pipelines we talked about. But they had used they used a token, and I wanted to replace it with a short code. And they'd already created 100 pages. So I wrote PowerShell code for Sitecore that would go replace all of those with my short code. So now they don't have to go to the 100 pages and go, you know, basically what they would have to do is go show editor, HTML, and then highlight and paste. And that could take 20 seconds an item, assuming you already had a list of items that you wanted to look at. And just kind of just so you know, based on that ACE code editor, I wanted to figure out other places where I could put that. Then I did an override in my production environment where I added that into their window. So I didn't like their window. This is a plain text view. So I added the ACE code editor into this window and hid all of their features. So with Sitecore, you can I guess it's a plug for Sitecore, right? So I can edit anything in Sitecore, anything that you see, except maybe this, except for like overriding this window itself. I could add my own little buttons up here, and I could have the button run PowerShell code to enforce something, like look for, I don't know, bad content, invalid content, like curse words or whatever you want. You want to
find the word Kleenex and replace with tissue.
Yes, yes, branding, any of that kind of information. If, like, so the company I work for, let's say they typed in a competitor's name. Well, we could look for that and replace it in other items and things like that. So there's so many options that you can do now that you've connected PowerShell to this.
So you can pretty much create your own function, list it over there as a shortcut,
Right.
and then have it run whatever you have that function.
Right, exactly.
Now that's just affecting, as far as the information that you're seeing here, this is all database driven in the back end, right?
Correct.
So all the information there is actually inside some database.
Yes.
Why not just attach to the database to do this instead of creating the shortcut?
Well, so in Sitecore, it's very flexible to make the changes, like to that little toolbar. And in Sitecore, I could create the functions, I could create the buttons through their UI, and manage everything. If I were to do that on the database side, then that requires other people to manage that. So if I'm let's say I'm a power user in Sitecore, so I can create content, change a page, and then go manage stuff with PowerShell. I don't have access to the database. I can't log into the web server and create a scheduled task to rename files, or I can't log into the database really ever. They don't ever let me do that to go do stuff. So this is our workaround to do whatever I want in PowerShell and be as destructive as I want in the web environment. So I can grant someone access to this button, for example, or I could deny them access to that button. I could, in this example, I have a developer tab. I could create my own tab, and in that tab, I can have a PowerShell console button. You can do whatever you want. You can configure everything that's out of the box. You can configure it to look and feel the way you want. So Sitecore provides you with the platform, and we've taken that by adding our own buttons to run our own code.
Kind of like CSS, right? We apply that.
Right. So with Sitecore, they will, all of these buttons they exist in something that looks similar to this tree on the left. So like a system, let's say modules, PowerShell, let's say console colors. Like I could configure all of this and that show up in a drop down somewhere.
It's kind of like skins.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and if you're working with something that provides developer API, it's safer to do that than to access the database. Because they want you to use the API, so if they change something, they'll make sure it's communicated. But if they expect the database to be only accessed via the API, they may make changes there that you'd have to keep up with.
Right.
Referential integrity.
Yeah.
Schema knowledge, validation, all the rules, all the safety stuff.
So if you're familiar with SharePoint, if you've ever looked inside of a SharePoint database, trying to figure out what needs to be changed is a nightmare.
Yeah.
You know, there's, I remember, so in 2007, if you look in their database, in one row, you'll have, let's say, 20 columns that say int1, int2, int3, int4, and then you get varchar 1, varchar, and so on. And like to really understand their data model would require a lot of time. And so with Sitecore, using their API, as you suggested, allows you to make changes without breaking something and then destroying your website. So I can use PowerShell to manipulate Sitecore items, and then that would delete, like let's say I wanted to delete an item. I could delete it in PowerShell. It goes into Sitecore's recycle bin, which is, it's like a little bucket somewhere in the database where they package it up, hide it somewhere, and then use their API to purge that data from the database. Just to kind of go with that theme, if I go to their control panel, database, you can clean up the database. So you can remove links, you can remove rows of data that are orphaned. And I would much rather use their API to do that. And a scheduled task and something that says, you know, these marketers, they don't know what they're doing, and they have 200 versions of something, so let's start getting rid of that. You know, they basically, in the workflows that you can do in Sitecore, I create an article and I publish it, and oh, I want to change another word, so I go create another one and publish it, and they could keep doing that. Now you have 200 versions, and you're like 30 days into it being released. So using this plugin will help me automate that kind of stuff. So this is distributed in a modular fashion. So you have, Sitecore allows you to package up your code and any Sitecore items into a zip file and deploy that into the environment. Therefore, you could write other extensions to the environment and then be able to use that within here. So you could create like a 301 redirect module, and that would be available. So this is just one way to extend Sitecore.
There's going to be another group in about 3 minutes.
Okay.
Bump us out of here.
So to wrap up, let's see. My information, I'll get that to Michael so that you'll be able to communicate with me if you have questions, complaints, whatever it may be. On my YouTube channel, I have videos of this, but I also have made PowerShell videos specifically using my handy dandy microphone. So I will, let's say splatting. If you've never seen splatting before, then you can go see in a 10-minute video how to do splatting in your scripts, whether you're in this Sitecore environment or just in a Windows environment. So
Michael, you have a automated website admin through a browser. That's web pages building web pages. That kind of like machines building machines.
yeah, it's pretty cool.
Michael, I'll send you an email so that if you want to send us anything to put in our SharePoint shared documents folder.
Oh, absolutely.
Then I'll post it there, and there's no restrictions. Anybody can grab stuff out of it.
Okay.
You don't have to.
It's free, but you have to register. I was going to bring some cards with me, and I didn't make it in the briefcase. But I think if you Bing SharePoint